No ifs, ands, or buts. Let's talk footwork and cuts, the basics you need to know for sword fighting. Hello everyone, Lauren here, and today we're going to be talking about essentials, the basics of sword fighting. If you were to fight with a sword, there are some things that you have to start with, some key concepts. And before we get into the footwork and the cutting, we have to understand a little bit about why these are so important, and that means we've got to talk about distance and timing. Now, sword fighting, as you might see in movies, what? No, we don't want that. Sword fighting is about moving, it's about controlling the distance. It's about understanding where my opponent is, judging the distance, and then my whole body is going to move into the distance to attack or out of the distance to defend. And footwork is really key to this. Anyone who tells you footwork doesn't matter, footwork is key. Footwork is everything. If you can't keep your balance, if you don't have your stance right, if you're not moving your feet properly, you're probably going to fall over. Certainly get tripped up, and you have to be able to learn this concept of distance and moving your feet to get into and out of distance. Now, if you move into distance, that shortens the amount of time you need in order to attack. If you move out of distance, that increases the time of your opponent, that what he or she needs to attack you. So, I move in, I cut down the time to reach the target. I move back, I am increasing the time the target needs to reach me. Also gives me more time to plan my defense. And these concepts of distance and timing are key to pretty much all martial arts. If you don't have your distance judgment down, you can't set up your timing. If you don't have your timing, you're not going to make the correct contact, whether it's weapon or unarmed, wrestling, whatever it is. These are key concepts. And the best way to be able to get into and out of distance is to use your feet. So like I remember from university and studying the Tale of Oedipus, know your foot. If you know your feet, then you know a lot to get by. So, what do we need to know? Well, first thing, my stance. Now, I'm going to start with a longsword guard. So that means my left foot forward because I'm right-handed. I'm just resting the sword on my shoulder as I talk. I'm explaining things to you. But I could be in this shoulder Vontag type guard for German longsword. Okay. My left foot is pointing forward. This is the direction I'm going in. That's where my opponent is. I can also imagine a line from my rib cage coming out. It's also pointing towards my opponent. My right foot is back, so that's my rear foot. It's not quite 90 degrees. I angle it in a little bit. It's about 75 to 80 degrees. And the most important thing is you're imagining that you're standing on either side of a line. My feet aren't going to impact. When I have this stance with my knees bent, and you can see I can comfortably bounce up and down, almost do a squat if you needed. And then squats are a good exercise to practice this. Knees are about over my toes, and if I slide my right foot forward, it just misses my left. And that's ideal. That's where I want my positioning to be. So this is how I open, and then there are 3 types of steps that are easy for me to take from this position. The first one is how I want to control distance. If I want to get into or out of distance, well then I need to do a stutter step. Now we're not shuffling our feet specifically, we're going to lift them, and the stutter step means that I move my front foot first, followed by my back foot. So I'm going to push off the back foot, move the front foot, and then catch up. And then I can stutter backwards by moving the back foot, and I'm lifting my feet each time. And this is good practice, and of course I want to make sure my foot would slide by. So you could put a piece of tape down if you wanted, painter's tape if you don't want to damage floor or carpet or anything like that, and then your feet are going to be on either side of that line so that you can move fluidly. And you just do these little steps. So this is how I would get into distance. Little steps, I'm judging it. I can do a bit bigger of a step. I can really get close to the opponent. Of course, I can also do a gathering step. If I just want to adjust the distance a little bit, I can start by moving the back foot, gather it towards the front foot, and then forward. Gather, back. So stuttering step means the foot closest to the direction you want to go moves first, and then the foot trails to catch up. So if I want to go back, my back foot is the closest to that direction. That's stutter. If I want to do a gathering, then it's the foot furthest from the direction moves, and then I move the leading foot. If I want to go backwards, leading foot gathers in, and there we go. I'm trying to keep my torso mostly straight. You don't want to fight like this. You want to bend your knees, be relatively upright in this system. Other systems, you will have leaning options. Sword and buckler has a whole bunch of hip hinging, but that is taught for a sword and buckler specific video. Okay, we have one last movement of the feet to deal with. And that would be the passing step. So one foot is going to pass the other. So if I were going to attack, or I was going to switch my guard to the other shoulder, I need to pass. So what happens is, I start transferring my weight to my front foot, lift up my back foot, it lands pointing towards the opponent. Now my left foot, which is now the back foot, turns, and it gets to that 75, 80 degree angle, and I'm still bending my knees, and I could move my sword, and I am in a different guard. So you see that everything is moving. I want to get out of the way and switch my guard. I want to switch my guard but move into the way. I'm closing the distance, cutting down the time I need to hit the opponent. I am moving out of the distance, increasing the time that I have to defend against my opponents. There we go. Now, putting all of this into cutting. So we've got our basics of footwork. We have 3 different types of moves that we can use with this sword. Talk about cutting, we're going to jump ahead in time. I've done a lot of studies of British military sabre as well, particularly Hutton's 19th century sabre. And that means a totally different pose. Right foot is predominantly forward for all of these moves. And as you move, your footwork is pretty much stuttering. There is also lunging. And a lunge means your rear foot stays exactly where it is, your front foot moves forward, and that gives you distance to attack, but you can also quickly retreat. So certain sword systems, like Sabre, are probably going to be all focused. And that means you would cut and your feet are moving. So your feet, sword begins to move first. It moves just a little bit into position. Remember, we're not winding up. So the sword moves. And then as I cut, I want my cut to kind of be in the middle of where my target is as my foot lands. That means I have to really judge my distance, make sure it's okay. If I have to adjust my distance, I've got to imagine where my sword is going to hit. Okay. Now, if we move to the arming sword, I can use it in a similar fashion. I might have my hand on my chest, my hip. I could start with the different guards. When I cut, what's really important is edge alignment. So one of the basic concepts you want to learn, not just timing your cut to land with your foot, but you want to make sure that the edge cuts a straight line. If your cut flubs and it curves, if it were to impact, it's just going to end up turning and sitting on the surface. This is a really good thing you learn when you cut pumpkins. If you don't have a clean edge alignment, if you're not a straight line, if you're not drawing the line of your X, which we'll explain in a second, it's just going to turn. You're not going to be able to just slice a piece off of the pumpkin. You kind of get the sword stuck in it. So it doesn't matter how sharp the sword is. Lining up your edge to draw a nice straight line through the target is what you want. And your ideal angle is probably looking at about 30 degrees, not 45. That can work, but a 30-degree cut is much better. That's because if you're coming in at 30 degrees, you have a lot of different things that you can impact. And if the opponent is going to defend, you still have options to try and cut or thrust into the opponent. If you're coming at 45 degrees and the opponent defends, you lose a lot of your options to follow up, to continue the attack. Now you probably have to defend, reset, do a lot more work. But if you're coming in at 30 degrees, your sword is still centered. Now when you cut, it's also important that you think about your torso. Imagine a line coming out from your ribcage towards the opponent. You want to keep that in a fairly narrow arc. So when I cut, you'll notice that my line is still close. My leading foot's going to point towards the opponent, and I am most of the turn. I don't want to cut like this, because my movement is now that way. I need my movement to go backwards and forwards. So by keeping my center line, this imaginary line between me and my opponent, by keeping it relatively straight as I cut, I am in a good position to retreat if I need it, or continue my attack. My center line is over this way, my momentum is going to go that way. So I want to keep my center line towards the opponent. And then imagine an X. If I do 2 cuts, and hopefully the camera keeps up with the focus. If I do 2 cuts, X, X. And so we could add footwork, and I could say cut, cut, recover. I'm drawing a fairly tight X. I'm keeping the edge aligned. I'm keeping my center line angled in a narrow arc towards the opponent. My foot, whatever foot's going to be the leading foot, is pointed towards the opponent, and my rear foot is always going to slide past. So at any time, I should be able to stop, move my foot, or even just look down at my feet and make sure that I'm not crossed over like that. Because if I wanted to do a passing step back, I'm going to hit my foot and I'm going to stumble. Instead, I want to be able to do a passing step backward without that issue. And that leads us to a combination. We're talking about the center line and our cuts. We can also move off of the line. So if there's an opponent in front of me and I want to cut the opponent, and if I'm cutting from my strong side, I might want to create some more space. I might want to get off of the opponent's line. I might want to change my center line. So here's my center line. I could step to the side and cut. My center line is still pointing fairly close to where the opponent is, but the opponent's line is now pointing past me. I could also do a passing step off the line, cut, and I've moved to the other side. I'm still focused. My energy is still directed towards the opponent. The opponent could be directed past me. This allows me to use distance to change the timing of my attack and help throw off the opponent. This is why we needed so much room today. We needed some space in order to do this because there's a lot of sword swinging going on, and we've got to be careful with the ceiling. It is a little low in here. Yeah, so we have different swords. Now there are a number of different cuts, different systems. Sabre, for example, if we could jump up to the 19th century Hutton saber, we're going to have 8 cuts. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But in a medieval longsword system, we may only talk about 4. And different systems will have cuts. Some will include cuts to the legs. Some will say don't cut to the legs. A lot of medieval stuff, we avoid the legs. We focus on the torso. A lot of later stuff, we can start adding in the legs. And it all depends on what the system is for. If we have a longsword, and again, we're just going to be in a basic shoulder guard. And I'm going to cut from this. I want to have some more distance away from the camera. The camera is doing some good work, trying, struggling, but managing to focus. Good job, camera. I cut. And the last thing we need to talk about is when I cut. Remember, I'm not winding up. I am pushing and pulling. We've talked a little bit about this before. We push and pull the sword to cut through. And everything is working. So the sword begins to move. I step and I push and pull. And ideally, you would cut to the waist. Now, if you're just beginning, cut all the way through. And there are things called butterfly cuts or infinity cuts or figure 8 cuts which help you practice and you do much bigger cuts. Can't do it in here because I will damage stuff. But you can practice by cutting through. Eventually you'll learn where the push and the pull come, and you'll stop your sword sooner, and that'll help you deliver the maximum energy. And again, we are cutting not quite 45. We want to be closer to 20 to 30 degrees from the center. And we are cutting a straight line, keeping our edge lined. With a two-handed sword, you push and pull. A lot of your power can be generated just like that. Winding up doesn't really give you anything extra. And that's this exercise I like to do with new people. So when we're in an intro class, have someone hold out a sword, and I'll show them the difference between a big wind-up swing and just a push and pull, quick cut. And they can feel in their sword that there's just as much impact. And that's because the physics of the sword dictates that if you pivot it on the grip, you can deliver just as much energy. Alright, so that, just a few basic points about footwork and cutting. Just a little introduction. There's so much to learn and a lot of practice. Footwork, always essential. Always need to practice it, especially changing guards, cutting with the sword. Your footwork is key. How you position your feet matters. So remember, know your foot. Know where your foot is. Your front foot pointing forward. Your feet relatively flat to the ground. This isn't about being on the balls of your feet. Some martial arts have that. This, you are centered. When you are landing that impact with the sword, if you are forward, it's going to jolt you if you're on the balls of your feet. If your feet are down and flat, back into frame, even if there's a block, I am stable. My feet are mostly flat. Sword and buckler, you are going to raise up a little bit and do hip hinging, but the moves are more subtle. Other European martial arts that we get into definitely encourage having your feet pretty much flat on the ground, low to the ground, bend your knees. You can almost feel like you're riding on a horse a little bit, except you're turned towards the opponent any number of degrees, 30 to 50 or so, off of where you would be sitting. So there we go. Basics. Footwork. Keep your edge lined. Nice narrow X cutting down to the hip. Measure your distance. Move into distance. Attack. Don't start your attack before you know the proper distance. You're going to miss, or you're going to be too close and run onto the opponent's sword. Very key things to remember. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, you can hit the notification bell, share it with your friends, and if you have questions about swords and sword fighting and arms and armor and history that you want to ask, leave a comment about it and we can do a future video to tell you all about these wonderful sword and armor type of things that you want to know. Thanks everyone, have a great day.